Becoming a father does something strange to you because at some point along the way, you start to see your own father differently. You stop seeing him as just your father and you start seeing him as a man who was trying to figure life out and probably still is, right? And lately, I've been sitting with that realization quite a bit. And the deeper I get into fatherhood, the more I continue my journey into manhood, really becoming the man my family needs, the man the moment demands. The more I find myself reflecting on my own father. Because if I look back at, a few episodes or the past episodes that I've made, I've spoken quite a bit about parts of my upbringing, parts of what I absorbed, growing up, things I told myself I didn't want to become, but becoming a father myself has forced me to look at those memories differently, to revisit those moments again, but now from a perspective of someone who is consciously stepping into fatherhood and really asking himself what it means to be a father. And it's almost like I'm having this out of body experience where I can suddenly see my father not just from the perspective of me as a son, but from the perspective of a man who was probably just doing the best he could with what he knew at the time. And honestly, this episode is really me just processing that because as much as I've grown, as much as I've matured emotionally, as much as I've become more emotionally regulated and build confidence in a lot of areas of my life, there are still things I wish I could sit down and say to my father face to face. And maybe one day that will happen. In fact, like I'm pretty sure that day will come. But until then, like for now, this is just my way of continuing to work through that and to say those things. And so before I get into it, just in case you're new here, my name is Andy. This is the Body of Work podcast. And this space is really me documenting the process of becoming the kind of man, the kind of father, the kind of husband my family needs, and also becoming a better man for myself. And I do this out in the open because my hope is that other men, other fathers might see parts of, themselves in the journey, in this journey that maybe something, shared here encourages them to reflect on their own path, even as I'm still figuring things out along the way. So yeah, let's get into it. Most of my life, I only saw my father through the eyes of a son, which is logical, right? You're put here on this earth, you know who your mother is, you know who your father is, and as a son, you just look at your father as, yeah, your father, your dad. And when you're a kid, your father is supposed to be everything. He feels like he's everything, right? He's supposed to have the answers. He's supposed to know what to do. He's supposed to show you what it means to be a man. And growing up, and this is more so as I got older, became more mature, there were things I realized like I really wanted from him. And again, this is not to bash my father. This is not to take away from what he was able to do. But there were things I wanted, right? I wanted presence. I wanted more guidance. I wanted those moments where you sit down and talk about life, talk about manhood, talk about what it means to carry yourself in the world. And if I'm being honest, a lot of that I had to figure out on my own. There were, moments, especially around sports, where I wish I could have had, where I wish he could have been there more. But now, as a father myself, I can see something I couldn't, clearly see back then. Like while I was, for example, like on the basketball court, he was working. And while I was playing sports or doing different activities, he was making sure I even had the opportunity, even had the space to be there in those places in the first place. Because looking back now, there were a lot of things I had. There was always food on the table. There were, clothes on my back. I was able to go to school, be with my friends, play sports. I was able to go out in the evenings, right? And even at odd hours of the night when I needed someone to pick me up, he would, after a long day, right, probably resting, still get up and come and get me and my friends. And those are the things you don't really think about as a kid. I had things that at the time I probably took for granted, like, I don't know, like the PlayStation or the Nintendo 64, the bike when I needed one, or the money to fix it when something broke off of it. And as a kid, you don't always connect those things to the sacrifice behind them. You just experience the result, right? But now, standing where I stand today, as a father myself, I realized that providing those things wasn't accidental. It came from, from him carrying his responsibility, from him doing what he believed a father was supposed to do. And the truth is, back then I didn't fully see that. Back then I mostly saw what was missing. Now I'm starting to see and understand and acknowledge the effort behind it. And I think that's where, the shift really started for me, because once I started seeing the effort, seeing the sacrifices, I started asking myself a different question. What must it have been like to be him, to be in my father's shoes? Not as my father, but as a man with responsibilities, a man with pressure, a man trying to figure out his own way in this world. A man who, at the end of the day, probably didn't have all the answers either. And as I think about that, I get taken back to, when I was younger. I think it's about 30 years ago now when I lost my grandfather. And at the time, I realized that, I lost my grandfather, but what I didn't fully understand back then was that my father lost his father. And he was around his 30s at the time. And now, standing again where I am today, I can't even begin to imagine what that would feel like. To lose your father at that age in life, still young, you're still figuring things out, still, becoming. And then I think about the fact that he grew up with, I think, six other siblings somewhere, and he was in, the middle child. And I start to, wonder, like, what kind of pressure that brings, like, what kind of role you take on in a family like that. What kind of expectations are there, like spoken expectations or unspoken expectations? And then losing your father on top of that, like, what does that do to how you understand manhood, to how you understand fatherhood, to how you understand responsibility? Because at the end of the day, everything he knew, everything he became, was also shaped by what he observed, what he absorbed, what was or wasn't passed down to him. And now, standing where I stand, I know what it feels like to be responsible for a family, to feel like you have to provide, to feel like you have to hold things together, to feel like you can't drop the ball. And the truth is, there are moments even now where I don't know exactly what I'm doing, right? There are moments where I'm figuring things out in real time, like I think most men are, right? There are moments where I question myself, where I wonder, am I even doing enough? Am I doing this right at all? And that made me think he probably had those same thoughts too, those same worries, that same pressure. Maybe he just didn't have the language for it. Maybe he didn't have the tools for it. And when and we have to remember, right? We grew up in two different times, because now in this day and age we have access to so much, the internet, resources, conversations like these, things that help us understand not just what to do, but how to understand ourselves in the process. And I can't imagine that being available to him in the same way. So maybe no one ever showed him how to talk about what he was feeling. Maybe no one showed him that it was okay to feel what he was feeling. Maybe no one showed him how to be present in a way I wanted him to be. And the same way I am now trying to be present with my son, with my daughter. And when I look at it from that angle, it doesn't erase anything. It doesn't take away what I felt or what I felt like I needed, but it adds context. It adds, nuance. And that's something I've really come to understand, because it's easy to look at your father as a son and think, he should have known better. But as a man, you start to realize he was probably just doing the best he could with what he had at the time, with the knowledge that he had at the time. And in a strange way, it's almost like that same sentence applies to me now, because I'm here thinking, I'm doing the best that I can. And at some point, my son might look at me and think, like, daddy, like, papa, like, you should have known better. And that's where it really hit me because maybe things I felt were missing were the very things that were never given to him either. And that's when it really clicked. This isn't just about me and my father. This is about patterns, generational patterns, things that get passed down not intentionally, but because no one stopped to question them. And in a strange way, that realization didn't make me feel more distant from him. It's actually making me feel a lot more closer to him, more understanding, more appreciative. Because for the first time, I wasn't just looking at him as the man who raised me. I was looking at him as a man who was and still is trying to carry more than I probably understood at the time. And I think that's why there are some things that I want to say to you now. I want to say it to my father. Um, so yeah, daddy, like this part is basically for you. And I don't even know if you'll ever see this, if you'll ever come across this episode, but this is something I needed to say, something I want to say. So, first of all, like I love you. And I thank you. Like I truly thank you. Like I thank you for providing for me. Thank you for making sure there was always food on the table, clothes on our backs, that we could go to school, that we could play sports, that we could have things. Thank you for loving my mother, for staying, for showing me that even when things got difficult, even when you weren't always at your best, you stayed, with mommy and you loved her. And that showed me something too, because now I understand none of that just happens. That comes from responsibility, that comes from sacrifice, that comes from showing up in the way you knew how. And I see that, right? I I truly see that. And I also want to say, there were things I didn't understand growing up, and maybe I still won't ever understand everything. But there were moments where I wished you were there more, moments where I wanted more guidance, more conversation, more presence when it came to certain things. And for a long time, I think I held on to that. But now, standing where I stand today, I see things differently because I know what it feels like to carry responsibility. I know what it feels like to try and hold everything together, to try and provide, to try and lead, to try and be strong, even when you don't fully know what you're doing all of the time, or if what you're doing is even the right thing. And I can imagine that you were doing the same in your own way with what you knew, with what you had. And I think for the first time, I'm really starting to understand that. Um, and I want you to know that even the things I once told myself I didn't want to become, they still shape me. They still taught me something. They still played a role in the man that I am today. And because of the man that I am today, with everything considered, it's hard for me to say that I would want it any other way because that's just not how life works, right? You make the best choices you can, and then you live with that, with what comes from that. And somewhere along the way, you grow. I remember hearing something. I think it was Steve Harvey. He said, appreciate your father, like love your father because he's the only man in this world who truly wants you to be a better man than him. And when I heard that, it really stayed with me. It struck a chord with me because I know as I continue to process things, as I continue to speak about my experiences, it might sometimes sound like I'm being negative or unappreciative, but that's not what it is. It's just me working through things. It's pain, it's confusion, it's growth that I'm learning to understand. And I know that might not always land easy, but I always believe that you've given me that space to become my own man. And I'm grateful for that. Because when I look at my son, your grandson Zane, I want him to be a better man than I am. And that's not taking anything away from me. That's love. That's responsibility. That's me understanding that one day he might look at me the same way I once looked at you, and he'll have things to process too. And in that moment, I hope I have the grace to give him that space the same way I'm asking for it now. So this isn't me looking back with resentment. This is me looking back now with understanding, with love, with appreciation, and honestly, with a lot of respect, because being a father, like, it's hard. It's not easy. There's pressure from all sides, there's responsibility. There are decisions you have to make that not everyone will agree with, and that just comes with the territory. And I realize now being a father isn't something you do perfectly. It's something you do the best you can with what you know and what you believe to be right at the time. And I truly believe that you did the best you could. And yeah, like, that's just something I needed to say. Whew. All right, like, that needed to be said. Um, all right, now, brother, back to you. And with that said, I think that's where this really lands for me, because at the end of the day, this isn't just about me and my father. It's about us as fathers, as men. Because just like I had things I needed from him, there's gonna come a day where our kids look at us the same way, where they reflect on what we gave them and also what might have been missing. And that's a heavy thing to sit with right now, but it's also an important one, because it reminds us we're not here to be perfect. We're here to be present. We're here to be aware. We're here to keep growing, and to let them see that. And if there's one thing I hope you take away from this, it's this: the version of you that got you here, the version that helped you survive, the version that protected you, that version isn't something to hate. It's something to understand. It's something to have compassion for. But it's also not the version you have to stay in, because if you know better, then it's your responsibility again to do better. And maybe, just maybe, it starts with a simple question, not just what kind of man do I want to be, but what kind of man will my kids remember me as? Because one day we won't be there to explain ourselves anymore, and all they'll have is what, we show them. And yeah, that's something that I've been sitting with.